Today, we're going to take a look at some updates for my Patreon product, The City of Ashes. We're going to look at the Heroes of Krynn Revisited Unearthed Arcana. We're going to take a look at two different Kickstarters, the Dungeonmorphs 4 Kickstarter by my friend Joe Wetzel at Inkwell Ideas, and the Fraternity of Ash adventure written by MT Black. And finally, we're going to do a product spotlight at the adventure The Isle of the Dreaded Accursed by JVC Parry and Mr. Tarask. This, along with our April Patreon questions on today's Lazy D&D talk show. I'm Mike Shea, your pal from Sly Flourish, and here on this show, we talk about all things D&D. This show is brought to you by the patrons of Sly Flourish. Patrons get access to all kinds of exclusive material, exclusive features, previews of upcoming products, previews of upcoming videos, a dedicated Discord channel, and all kinds of other things. But most of all, they help me put on shows like this. And we're going to take a look at one of the products that patrons of Sly Flourish get access to, which is the City of Arches. The City of Arches is a product I've now been doing for a few months, 2 or 3 months, I think. And it is now a 22-page PDF miniature city source book, a city designed for high fantasy adventure. It has all kinds of different adventure hooks, all kinds of different ways that you can integrate your characters, all sorts of different things you can do, and lots of tools to help you sort of build it. I've added one new major section to the City of Arches this month, which is the Worlds Beyond the Arches section. You can see like all the kinds of cool stuff. We have a really, really awesome side view map. We added this in last month. We have all kinds of different tools, locations that you can explore, NPCs to interact with, random events that can occur in the city, all kinds of like neat stuff. Just it's a city rich with adventure. It's really it's designed, you could certainly run 20 levels of adventures in and around the city. But then I really wanted to like blow up and go way outside. And I created a 2-page section called Worlds Beyond the Arches. And Worlds Beyond the Arches, it's 10 different worlds that you might hear about, you might learn through lore or mosaics on the walls or ancient dusty tomes, crumbling tomes, or in some cases, the gods help you, you may go to one of these realms. Most of them are pretty risky places to go to. I would definitely think of these as tier 4 level places to go to, but some of them maybe not. And they're not just like weird planier places. They are all pretty weird planier places, but they're worlds that you might explore beyond the arches, like Corvax, the primeval land of the Red Star, Vinan, the Forgotten Library, Tarach, the Jaws of Chaos, Mafatar, the Infernal Machine, Drendon, the world of air and water, Iruwind, the Endless Forest, Io, the Forge of Creation, Threska, the Desert of the Dead Gods, Drakeholm, Land of the Dragons, and Deathreach, the Endless Dungeon. These are all kinds of interesting worlds that you might get to through the old archways that exist inside the City of Arches. So that has been added to the City of Arches. It's page 16 and 17 of the book. Patrons have access to it right now. So if you are a patron of Sly Flourish, and you can see we also have like a first level adventure and everything like that. This source book, this miniature product, miniature source, I'm going to call it a source book. Book is probably a little over anxious. A guidebook to the City of Adventure. I like that, right? I like it. I wrote it. So this is available to patrons, along with a lot of other exclusive material you can get to be as a patron of Sly Flourish. But patrons have access to it right now. So if you go to your patron page, you go to your rewards page on Patreon, it's like one of the first posts. And you can download this, and it has those new Worlds Beyond the Arches in it right away. So I'm going to be sending out a patron note to everybody to let them know. But if you happen to be watching the show and you are a patron, you have access to it right now. I forgot to mention, next week, we will not be having a show next week. So enjoy your week. And in 2 weeks, we will return with another episode of the Lazy D&D Talk Show. So in D&D news, Wizards of the Coast, I don't know how often they've ever done this, released a revised Heroes of Krynn Unearthed Arcana. So they had released a Heroes of Krynn one before, and some of it is that they've now announced that Dragonlance is actually going to be a thing. But some of it was they got some feedback, I guess some pretty strong feedback about some of the things that they did. And they put it back into a revised version of the Heroes of Krynn. I'm not going to dive into it too much. It's interesting that some of the things that they have done here. Probably the biggest one that I noticed is that they have this idea of bonus feats. And this is the idea that if you pick a background that isn't from Dragonlance, you get a free feat. And the feat can either be Divinely Favored, which is in this one, Skilled, which lets you kind of train in a skill and get a bonus to a skill. Or Tough, right? You get extra hit points. And at 4th level, you get another bonus feat from either the first level list or one of these other ones, Alert, Mobile, Sentinel, Warcaster, and things like that. So what's interesting about this is that means that theoretically you could have 4 feats by 4th level. So it brings up a couple of interesting questions to me. One is, are feats no longer considered optional, right? That in 5th edition, feats were an optional feature, right? If the core 5th edition book, feats are an optional feature. You typically get an ability score increase. And then as an option, you instead of an ability score increase, you get a feat. The reality is, I think I did a poll on this. The vast majority of games use feats. The vast majority of characters are using feats. D&D Beyond defaults to having feats as an available feature, right? You can turn it off, but it defaults to having an available feature, which means that the optional one is more like not having feats. But you do have to sacrifice ability score increases to get feats. And typically, when I've been playing and my players have been playing, the 4th level, they most always take an ability score increase because it kicks you up to 20, right? Or you can get bumped up to a much higher stat if you take an ability score increase over a feat, which often means you don't get a meaningful feat until 8th level. I know a lot of DMs actually give players an optional feat right in the beginning to let their characters grow a little bit more. The question is are you going to get into zany stuff, zany weird combinations of feats faster later, particularly like Sentinel, right? Sentinel is a really crunchy feat. And if you pick Polearm Master, a Polearm Master Sentinel, you can do some kind of really interesting things, right? So I wonder about this, and I wonder what, then the big question is, well, what does that mean for the next edition? And they tried to be careful to say, oh, this is just for Dragonlance. It's yeah, sure. You're not looking at this and wondering whether this is core. So that's really interesting. It cracks me up at the idea that you can pick a feat, or you can pick Divinely Favored, which means everybody's Divinely Favored, right? We're all favored. We're all favored equally. We're all Divinely Favored equally. I don't know, it cracks me up. The other nice thing, I was worried about Divinely Favored because Divinely Favored allowed for wizard spells. And I was I'm immediately going to have to ban Shield as a Divinely Favored spell because Shield is really, really powerful. Everybody wants Shield. And Shield is one of those 1st level spells that would benefit you your entire career. If you're a 20th level fighter, you would love to be able to cast Shield, right? It's such a powerful spell. And I was I don't want everybody to have Shield. I don't want everybody to have access to that spell. So I was going to block it. Well, now you can't because wizard spells are not from the sets of spells that you can pick from. So you're not going to be able to get Shield. And I'm okay, I'm good with that. Yeah, so interesting stuff. And, it's always interesting to see where it goes. Better people than I have dove in more into a lot of the changes that are going on in here. I always listen to my friends Sean and Teos at Misdirected Mark at Mastering Dungeons. I love to hear them talk about this stuff. So if you're interested more in what it means for Makender and what it means for this other stuff, there's other places. Because I was mainly interested in the feat idea. And this question of are feats no longer an optional feature? Are they now? Is it now considered a core ability? We're going to take a look at 2 Kickstarters today. The first is from my friend Joe Wetzel at Inkwell Ideas. This is the Dungeonmorphs 4 Kickstarter. So Inkwell Ideas has a bunch of different products. They have a really popular cartography program that they've done for a long time, that he's done for a long time. But he also has these things called Dungeon Dice. Dungeon Dice are one of the more common things you see at a gaming convention. You go and you talk about it. Oh, that's interesting. Dungeon Dice are large formatted dice that has a single color map on it that no matter what orientation you angle it can fit with the other dice to form a small dungeon, right? You can get 60 of these dice, you shake them up, you roll them out, you set them together, and you've got a dungeon. You can arrange them and line them up in different ways, but they always end up creating this kind of dungeon. It is a really neat tool to kind of shake up your thoughts about building a place. If you want to build a quick dungeon, and you want to get some ideas about what the orientation of that dungeon might be like or how those things work, you can take these dice, you can roll them, you can set them out, and you can look at them and see how they go. Obviously, it's not really playable. You can't use the dice as a map, but it's a good. I have some. Joe and I are friends, and I have some sets of dice around here somewhere. I think I got them in this box. No, I got my side quest deck. I don't have them in the box, but really cool tools and really kind of fun way to sort of shake things up. You know how I feel about randomness. I love randomness. I love using randomness and creativity together to come up with interesting things. These dice do it. But the dice are actually only one part of what he's got going on in this Kickstarter. It's a great big Kickstarter with a lot of different things. So the other thing he has is if dice aren't really your thing, and the idea of rolling these dice aren't your thing, you can get a bunch of these cards, and they are about 3 inches on a side, I think. Make sure I've got that right. 2.5 inches on a side. So again, not playable, but playable enough that you could put them out on a table and actually run them with a group. And it's all of the different orientations of all the things that you would find in the dice. So you can get 102 of these things, shuffle them out, orient them, and make yourself a dungeon. Then the other cool thing are these 10-inch dry erasable battle mats that are actually fitted for miniature play. So in this case, you could take 4 or 6 of these things, you could line them up on your table, and you can actually play off of them. So that's a really interesting. I haven't tried those yet. I want to try those out. And then he has a 100-page book of bonus modular encounters. Now, as the Kickstarter is growing, you can add new, they're going to be adding other new products in this, including extra dice into the dice packs. So the dice sets are going to get bigger, 7, 8, maybe even 9 dice for a dice pack. So they're a little pricey if it's only 6, but as the stretch go out, they might add more dice. That pricey dice set is definitely going to be more valuable. There are digital versions of all of this as well. The digital versions of the large format ones you can drop directly into a virtual tabletop. If you're using an advanced virtual tabletop like Roll20 and things like that, you can change the orientation on them. You can pile them together. If you're using like Owlbear, it's not going to work directly in Owlbear, but you could use an image editor outside of Owlbear, orient your maps, get stuff set, drop it into Owlbear and use it that way. Or you could use like a single tile, and that would work in Owlbear pretty well. So, a really neat mix of physical dice, small cards for inspiration, large cards for actual play at your table, digital versions of those so you can play with them. The other thing he does that's really interesting is he has a font. So you can actually add it to like a word processor as a font, and then you can drop in the tiles as a character of text and then change them and orient them. So you don't have to manipulate them just as JPEGs. There's an actual vector-based version usable as a font, and I thought that was fascinating. So really neat stuff. Check out his Kickstarter. You can find the link to the Dungeonmorphs Kickstarter in the show notes below. Really cool stuff. And I am looking forward to seeing what comes out. Well, big difference. One last thing to mention. Big difference is there's new orientations of these dice. So they're doing a layer set, which has sort of a brown and yellow on brown, and a sewer set. So totally different sets of dice than have ever been out before. But you can get all of the old. You can get all of the old sets. And here's an example of one of the cards. I don't know if he has the fonts, but yeah, here's the box that has all of the tiles in it. This is what a tile looks like. The tiles are really cool. Like those are really, really good, really, really fun maps. So neat stuff. So check out his Kickstarter and take a look. It looks really cool. Fun stuff. The other Kickstarter I want to put a spotlight on is Fraternity of Ash. Fraternity of Ash is a very straightforward adventure for the 5th edition of D&D. It is made by MT Black. MT Black is a big publisher of adventures on the DMs Guild, very popular publisher of adventures on the DMs Guild. Also a writer for Descent into Avernus, wrote for Wizards of the Coast. And he's done a lot of really cool stuff. And I'll tell you, the pricing on this stuff is really good. $8 for the PDF. It is a straightforward 4 to 8 hour adventure of 1st to 4th level characters, for first to 4th level characters. And I love these like straightforward adventures. I previewed one on the last week's show as well, right? Not everything needs to be these giant campaign books. Sometimes it's just fun to have a quick adventure. And, it's 45 digest-sized pages. So one thing about MT Black's books is that they actually can be read on a decent, if you have a good-sized phone, an American-sized phone, you can actually read them off of a phone. And it works really well. So I am always excited to see what MT Black has coming out of his mind. I really love the stuff that he's got, and I recommend picking up. So there's 2 different pledges, a $7 where you get the digital pledge, and an $11 where you get the digital pledge plus a voucher to get the print-on-demand version. I went with the print-on-demand version. I like to have the option of being able to get it on print-on-demand, and probably will do so. So very cool. You can, now this is interesting. I didn't know that you got it, but all backers get a copy of the Iskandar sourcebook, 112-page city sourcebook. I have previewed that book on this show before. I think it's a fantastic city sourcebook. It inspired a lot of what I did with City of Arches. I really love this idea of like a focused city sourcebook that is easily digestible and really cool. So take a look at Fraternity of Ash by MT Black. Fiendish. Oh, it's got cults. Look at that. Fiendish cults. Who doesn't like fiendish cults? So, fiendish cult and a sinister plot await you in this adventure for the world's greatest role-playing game. So check that out. Really, cheap price, right? What do we say? $5 for the PDF if you just want the PDF. And I think $8 for the PDF plus a print-on-demand voucher. The print-on-demand voucher, of course, you are paying for the cost of printing, right? So it's only $8. It's only $3 more than the PDF, but that's the $3 that's going to MT Black. You are paying for the actual price. So, we have to figure out how much the print-on-demand cost is. But I've done that many times before, and it works really well. My Kickstarters used to do it that way, and it works really well. So that is Fraternity of Ash by our friend MT Black. So now we're going to take a look at the Isle of Dreaded Accursed. Isle of Dreaded Accursed, I think also was part of a Kickstarter. I don't remember how this came about, but it is a tier 2 adventure, 5th edition adventure, again, focused adventure, 68 pages, written by Mr. Tarask and JVC Parry. JVC Parry, Josh Parry, is everywhere. He writes all kinds of different stuff. And it is a very straightforward sea-based adventure. It's built into big chapters, kind of major events happen in each chapter, and kind of starts off with, I think you have to, you get like a mission from a local lord to go running out and take a look at strange things that are happening out in the sea. A lot of it is tied to this evil sea goddess, Elverath. Small cult. Hey, look, another cult. Small cult of worshippers that build a temple in her name. So a neat kind of seafaring adventure. Reminded me a bit of Ghost of Saltmarsh, but obviously is going to be tied tighter together than Ghost of Saltmarsh was. Ghost of Saltmarsh, all the adventures are sort of independent. You could kind of run a thing that connected them. I did, but wasn't built that way. This one is clearly built that way. Beautiful layout, beautiful design. Really, really, great looking art. The maps are fantastic. It is a really solid. One of the things that just like I've become enamored by is the quality of adventures that are coming out from independent publishers. This is something that took a few years to happen, right? It took a while, but now we're starting to see publishers that, small independent publishers who are putting out really tremendous stuff. The layout has gotten much more beautiful. The style, it's as good as anything you'd find from any of the major publishers, right? These are really, really good, really good looking stuff. So yeah, 40-page adventure, custom monsters, lots of interesting things going on. I don't think... So there's a little bit of like a twist at the end. I don't want to spoil it too much, but there's kind of like a twist at the end. And I always worry that the twist at the end, if it doesn't play out exactly right and somebody figures something out far earlier, how does the game go then? It's a little trick like that, that sort of like, curse your inevitable betrayal. Sort of that problem. Nice maps, and I think you get, when you pick up Isle of Dreaded Accursed, you get the map pack, a VTT compatible map pack. Designed for 5th to 10th level characters. It's got bone dragons in it. Really, really good looking fun adventure. So if you're looking for an aquatic adventure, if you are running your own aquatic adventure and you want some ideas to harvest from, even if it's just pictures or even if it's maps, this looks like a good adventure where you could grab a lot of material for it. So really cool stuff. I like it very much, and I recommend it. I would check it out. It is $15 for the PDF, available on Drive-Thru RPG. 68-page adventure, and set for tier 2. Let's do some Patreon questions for April. Every month, I put up a post on Patreon asking for people to post any questions that they like. People post their questions. I answer all of them on Patreon. Some of them I answer on this show. Some of them become the premise of a video or a newsletter article. So, Jake says, how do you decide which plans of the villains the PCs get to interrupt and thwart, and which ones have already happened when they get there? This is a fantastic question. I don't know how to balance giving the players agency to stop bad things before they happen, with the excitement and drama of having to respond to a bad thing that happened. For example, in Rise of Tiamat, I assume the players would be disappointed if they didn't get to fight Tiamat, but the players will do everything they can to stop Tiamat from being summoned, given the opportunity. So how do you decide which opportunities to not give the players, because dealing with the resulting bad thing would be more fun? This is a really... I just spent a good chunk of Friday on an article that I had been monkeying around with for a while called, it's about the resilient plans of villains. And the idea here is in Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, we have a villain. We talk about fronts, right? And we have like imagine you have a campaign, you have 3 villains. Each villain has a goal, something they're trying to accomplish, and each of them has steps that they're taking to accomplish that goal. Well, the problem that they have is what if the players or the characters interrupt one of their steps? Does that ruin their goal? And the answer is maybe sometimes, but good villains are going to have robust, resilient plans in which they have primary and alternate paths, right? So imagine you have a primary and alternate path. And an example in Rise of Tiamat is you need the 5 masks of the dragons to summon Tiamat. In order to summon Tiamat, you need a couple of things. You need 5 dragon masks and you need a giant pile of gold, right? Well, if the characters thwart getting some of the gold, now the cult of the dragon has to do something else, right? They have to get gold from somewhere else. So they might have an alternative plan. We weren't planning on harvesting all the money from the rich people of Waterdeep. We were going to steal it from poor villages, but you took all of that because you got the island. You stole the lair that had all the gold in it that the White Dragon was protecting in Hoard of the Dragon Queen. So that means we got to get gold somewhere else. So now they have to go get gold somewhere else. Oh crap, you took 3 of the 5 masks and we only have 2 masks left, right? What are we going to do? Well, it turns out you can sacrifice ancient dragons. And the power you get from sacrificing ancient dragons is as powerful as if you had the dragon masks. That's an alternate path, right? They don't want to sacrifice ancient dragons, but they can do so because they don't have the masks because the dumbass characters took them. So the way to think about this is what plans do villains have and what are their alternate plans, right? And if you want to have a villain where the characters are able to thwart the villain, but the villain is still able to move forward the plan, they should have a resilient plan. They should have a plan where they have a step A. They would prefer to do A, B, and C, but if they can't do A, B, and C, they will instead do D, E, and F, right? For every plan, for every step, they should have an alternate step. Ideally, that alternate step isn't nearly as good for the villain as the primary step. It's not as easy. It's harder. It isn't as good. Whatever the output isn't as valuable. They have to do something they don't want to do. And that way, the characters are still thwarting the villain. They're just not stopping the goal, right? Now, in some cases, they will stop the goal. In some cases, they'll get ahead of it. And they win. They win early. They manage to stop a villain. That's why we have 3 villains, right? If they manage to go and attack one of the villains. So one of the villains in my Eberron game was the Emerald Claw. The Emerald Claw was planning on taking a giant dragon shard, bringing it to Sharn, and blowing it up and destroying Sharn. Well, guess what? Their plan was thwarted early. They never even got close. They only got close enough to manage to give useful information to another villain. And that villain took that information and ran with it. So one of the things that you have when you have villains and plans is if the characters focus on one of the villains and manage to thwart their plan, they win and they get to defeat that villain, but you have 2 other villains, right? That's why you have 3. It's like you not only have a robust, resilient, villainous plan, you also have a resilient campaign because you have multiple backup villains, right? So that sort of webwork and tapestry of multiple villains, each with primary goals and each of them with plans, and those plans have multiple parallel steps or multiple alternative steps that they could take, builds this tapestry. And then you get to, that way they're kind of moving forward and you get to decide which of the fun ones that are going to be in front of the characters, which of the fun ones are going to be able to disable. They still feel like they're accomplishing something, but they're not, but you're not completely thwarting the issue. So Jake, the really interesting topic. I'll probably do another video on this topic. I certainly have a news article I just wrote. It's actually coming out on Monday. So Monday it's on Sly Flourish. Tuesday it will be in the newsletter. So if you want to see that article, subscribe to the Sly Flourish newsletter and you'll get all these kinds of articles. Great stuff. Alex S. says, I know you have spent a reasonable amount of time with 4E. I did. I played through all of 4E. I became a published author during 4E. And I wanted to get your thoughts on the points of light base setting and the overall philosophy on POL style game. How can you use the lazy DM tools to make a perilous but heroic POL campaign? So yeah, the idea of points of light is that instead of having a well thought out, well published area where like everything is known, the paths are known, the things that are between the paths are known. Instead, that you have these sort of beacons of areas that are safe, that are surrounded by unknown wilderness. So I never hung on too tightly to that idea. I know that idea resonates with people a lot, But really, all of the places can be like that. Forgotten Realms is like that. They have the Mirror of Dead Men, but what the hell's in there? They have the Troll Moors. What the hell's in there, right? Lots of things can happen on these roads between cities. There's and Wizards of the Coast is adding new places in between these areas all the time. So really, anything can be a Points of Light setting, right? And any of the kind of traditional fantasy settings can be Points of Light. Eberron can be a Points of Light setting. And I don't think that there's any specific DM tools, lazy DM tools, that work with like Points of Light that don't work with other places. I think the idea of point crawls, right? The idea of a point crawl works really well. I talk about point crawls in the Lazy DM's Companion. I have articles and stuff like that. So I think you can just, I think it's more of a philosophy that you have, which is that the wilds are dangerous, right? The spaces in between towns and cities are dangerous, and anything can be there, and it's very unknown. And this is the idea that like most, 99% of the villagers in a city or in a town never leave the area of the town in their lives, right? They never travel to these other places. I think you can just sort of hang on to that idea, but I don't think there's any specific tools that really support Points of Light versus, I don't even know what the opposite of Points of Light are, like a rich setting where everything is known. Because D&D are games of adventure, and of course you're going to have like bandits on the wayside who try to kidnap you only to have a dire bullet burst out of the ground and eat the bandits, right? Which would make for a pretty fun encounter if you want to make a fun encounter. The worlds are always like that. So I don't know that I have any specific, I don't know if I have any specific guidance for that one. Ian R says, I find ranged combat and many of the spells with huge ranges hard to incorporate into my online battles. Maps seem to cater to just short to medium range combat. Do you have any advice on how to cater to the mix of ranges? I don't actually worry about long ranges. It's interesting that a bow can go 180 feet or whatever, that fireball has like 120 foot range. The problem is if you try to build situations where you're giving people the advantage of those really long ranges, what's like there's a warlock pact where you can get like a 240 foot range, with an Eldritch Blast, right? Which is 48 squares, right? And the problem is like if you build a situation where that's advantageous to that character, that means your dwarf fighter has to spend 16 rounds running across the battlefield to go get into a melee. So that's not. That, is that really that interesting? I don't find those kinds of real long ranges to be the interesting part of the story that we're telling. It's fine that they're there, fine that those long ranges are there, but personally, I never worry about making sure that that people have the advantage of that long range. There can, of course, be situations in the game where they go, oh, my bow can shoot really long way, and I can see that guy. I'm going to take shots at him while they're coming. Like, we're going to do that. Sort of like Legolas standing on the hill when the wargs are running at him, and he's just firing arrow after arrow after arrow after arrow, right? He's just bang, 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 until the horse comes and picks him up, or he grabs on the horse, right? So there could be circumstances and situations like that. I don't know that I would worry too much about trying to make those events happen. I would let the story dictate when it makes sense for long ranges to have an effect. And many times that might be outside of combat. Oh, I can fireball that hobgoblin camp from the mountain. I don't even have to go down and fight him because my fireball has such a long range. Cool, right? So Ian, that's my kind of thought on it. Matt M says, I'd like to ask your thoughts about reskinning monsters versus creating custom monsters. This is a topic I talk about all the time. You always suggest reskinning monsters that exist as a good lazy DM tip, and I see the value of that, but here's my dilemma. I'm working on a big bad evil guy for my tier 1 right now. At 5th level, any CR 5 to 7 spellcaster seems to have around 50 to 80 hit points and no legendary actions or legendary resistances. Even with minions in the fight, I'm sure my party will gang up on the big bad evil guy. I feel like I need a boss with more survivability. I think I need to homebrew something with legendary actions, resistances, and probably a ton more hit points. Otherwise, she's just going to die in round 2 and it'll be anticlimactic. How have you handled this kind of thing in the past, and what would your advice be for this situation? So there's levels of reskinning, right? There much like there's not like Theater of the Mind and gridded combat, that there's a range of different map styles that exist. Same way, like when you reskin, there's like, running a monster that's right out of the book all the way to building a homebrew monster where every step of it has been done by you. There's ranges, and those ranges can be, you just call it something different. The range might be, it's a different creature type. Another one might be, you take one or two features that make sense for that monster and add it to an existing stat block. There's all sorts of different ones. And I think that you can go far by taking, so it sounds like your big bad evil guy, it's a tier 1 bad guy. So there'd be 4th level or 5th, I guess. If at 5th level, So you're saying at 5th level, that's tier 2. But let's assume that's at 5th level, right? And 5th level, you got some pretty robust characters. So if you have a CR 5 to 7 spellcaster, let's take the mage, right? We'll take the standard mage step. Whoops. Right? And you just want to have a boss that's the mage. The mage is CR 6, but you're right. 40 hit points is really low. Well, guess what? I don't have to custom make a character to say, you know what? This one has 120 hit points, right? It was really easy for me to say, it has 120 hit points now, right? That is very fast for me to do. I can do that in my head. I don't have to customize anything. And now I have a creature who's 3 times more survivable than this one. I can just say it. Do I have to come up with a reason why? Nope. She has magic shields, right? She has a magical shell of protection, and when you're hitting her, it's cracking and cracking and cracking, and cracking through those shields. That's the equivalent of her losing hit points, right? So she might only have 40 real hit points, but she has 80 temporary. You don't have to come up with mechanics, right? Pretend she has 80 temporary hit points that she gave herself because she's got this magical shell of protection. Legendary action and legendary resistance. I mean, I'm pretty sure you can just add that yourself, right? And we can add this in and say this particular mage, this boss mage is legendary, right? So she has legendary resistances. We know what that means already, right? Legendary actions, we might say she can fire off cantrips as legendary actions. If you look at like the Lich can do that, right? So that means she can fire off Firebolt, right, as a legendary action, and she can do one of those at a time. Maybe you could give 3 legendary actions and she could cast like a 1st to 3rd level spell, right? So she could fire off magic missiles. She could fire off 2 firebolt. I mean, that'd be pretty brutal, right? Very brutal. But you can play with it, and you can during the game you can kind of see. But you notice we didn't change. We're not making a custom stat block. I'm just talking, right? I'm just saying words, and we can still come up with we can take the mage stat block and turn it into a pretty powerful boss. I don't have to homebrew it though. I'm not coming up and figuring out what her intelligence score is. I've got it right now. I might say like, DC 14 plus 6, I'm just going to increase those by 1. So there's a lot of stuff you can do to increase a monster, to change a monster stat block. It's still reskinning. It's deep reskinning. You're getting down in there. You're getting past the surface layer, right? But it's not hard. And you could jot down on a 3x5 card a few of the changes that you want to make just so you remember them, or you could just have them in your head. And you could do a lot of these on the fly. I feel like I could make a legendary mage boss on the fly and not write anything down. And it's those things I just mentioned. Give it a butt ton of hit points. Maybe increase its attack and DC by 1, maybe 2. Give it legendary resistance and give it some legendary actions. And I think you're in a good spot. So I think you can still get far. I would argue that you can still get far with reskinning before you have to go design a monster from scratch. David P. says, following up on the question about standby backup players, how do you incorporate the backup players into an ongoing campaign? Do they play their own characters that pop in and out of the game, or do they play the missing players' characters? So this falls into my rule that you always want to make it as easy as possible for people to get into the game and play, which means you don't need to do anything. Like just give them a character and then say, oh yeah, your new friend is with you, right? Like make it as easy as possible and don't worry about the continuity of the story. Most DMs, I think I did some polls on this, and most DMs do not worry about the continuity of the story when they're incorporating characters that are in and out. You can kind of design it a little bit if you look at the character and say like the character wanders off and then wanders back in. We had a character that was very funny. It was Krynn, a wraith, or white. It was a white champion fighter played by one of my players who would come in and periodically. And the shtick was Krynn would always just kind of like show up like captured or frozen in a thing of ice or somewhere else. And it was like, how did he get all the way here? Well, he rode by balloon and then the balloon fell and then he got frozen in ice. It was hysterical. So you don't have to have a perfectly tight story. It can be fuzzy. It can be funny. All the players understand why you're having this character get ingrained there. But one of the things you might do is like if you have a player who's on call who has a character, you might try to figure out how their backstory is such that they can kind of come in and out of the game, right? And there's a lot of different creative ways to do that. Like if you're deep in a dungeon, right? And it's like, no way that character could have been here. Well, what if there's a stone statue of the character who's like frozen, holding a scroll of stone to flesh in its hand, right? And you're like, how'd you get here? Oh, I wandered down here and I got hit by a basilisk. And I was trying to use my scroll and then I got turned to stone. So you come up with, wacky ways, right? As a fun exercise, come up with 10 ways that character could be dropped into the session. And it'll spurn some ideas for you. But yeah, the main thing is it doesn't matter that much. The important thing is playing games with your friends. So anything you can do to bring that character into the story easily and fast, even if the continuity is not great, your players know why it exists. It's because your friend is sitting right there ready to play, right? And everybody wants to play. Get past the hard parts and just get to playing as a group. Doug P says, how do you show conflicting factions to PCs without just telling them? Secrets and clues, right? You gave me a brief question. Thank you for that, by the way. 1 sentence, quick question. And I'll give you a quick answer, which is through secrets and clues. Like there's two things you're doing. We talked about villains earlier that your villains, you have multiple villains. Your villains have a goal and your villains have steps that they're taking. And ideally, those steps are things that are visible to the characters somehow. And the way they would learn about those steps that they're taking is to hear about them from secrets and clues. They discover things. So if you have a campaign that's got a lot of intrigue between conflicting factions that are fighting against one another, what are the physical things or what are the things that the characters can discover that show them those shifts in the faction? Are they starting to see things? An example of this is Princes of the Apocalypse. There's 4 different factions that are all fighting against each other. And as the players are dismantling one of them, the others are getting further along. So what are the things that you can see that show that those factions are changing? But the easy way to do it is if you're keeping track of it through your villains and their goals and their steps, then you can look at those villains' goals and steps, and you can create secrets and clues, and then drop those secrets and clues in front of the players so that they can see that the things with the factions are changing. So I hope that answers your question, Doug. Thank you for the question. Nate H says, I'm 20 sessions into a swashbuckling campaign, Tier 2, and the characters have just defeated the second of 5 pirate bounties. Given that we play twice a month at most, I feel that it's moving too slowly, and I've written myself into a bit of a corner having 5 pirate lords. Do you have any tips for picking up on the pace of a campaign now that it's taking too long? We can look one question up about factions and say, I bet the pirates are fighting themselves. And what if 2 of the other pirate groups have been destroyed by a third or been encapsulated by a third, and now 3 of those pirate captains are now 1, and a bunch of their ships sunk and a bunch of them have mutinied, but now there's internal factions. There's interesting things going on with internal factions, but there's really only 1 pirate lord left. And that's because things happened to the other 2. Maybe one of those pirate captains wandered off to a haunted island and never came back, right? And they're like, well, who knows, right? So the world is evolving, and it means that those 5 pirate captains can also evolve, right? That can also shift and change. And dramatically reduce themselves as one group eats another group. So yeah, you can shrink things down quite a bit by having external forces or bad choices reduce some of those pirate captains. But all of this gets into the same thing we were talking about before, which is having multiple villains. Those villains have goals, they have plans, but sometimes they will clash and one villain will eat another villain, maybe literally, right? So Nate, that's how I would do it. I would have the bandit captains fighting each other, and one of them might destroy the others or even bring them. Alexander R says, in my Eberron campaign, my party accidentally, this is a bad one. My party accidentally released a Dracolich that went on to rip open the gates of Kyber and release the overlords of the Daliker. After releasing the Dracolich, there's going to be a 2-year time skip. I love time skips, where the monsters of Kyber overrun the continent. And the 2 overlords and 2 Daliker in something of the last war, right? Remnants of the Last War, I forget what it's called. And Dracolich divvy up Corvair among themselves to rule. At the same vein of Wolverine Old Man Logan, how do I show the large change to the state of the world and make it really feel like the second age of demons has come? I would start by blowing up Sharn, right? I would. So first of all, boy, this is dark, right? Man, you're taking this world that's all like high fantasy and beautiful and then turning it into this thing. So I would... a few things I would do. One, I would blow up Sharn. I would have Sharn collapse. Like whatever the magic was that was keeping Sharn upright, that Sharn is now a necropolis. It's a massive dead city with lots of people destroyed. I would look at the empires and I would say which groups have taken over which empire, which groups are now completely owned by Daliker, which ones are completely just twisted by madness. The Droam, I think, is a really interesting one. Turning the Droam into good people, I think, is really neat. The idea that the monstrous race of the Droam and the daughters of Sorakal, they're your heroes, because they're the ones actually keeping the real bad people at bay, right? You also might have Arganesson, like the dragons of Arganesson might look at it and say, they might do the same thing they did with Zendrek and say, Zendrek has turned into this terrible place because of the giants, the giants of Kolsir. So we're going to have to go in there and destroy it. So now the dragons could be villains because they're coming in to say, we got to wipe the slate clean before this gets over to our world too. So I think there could be there's a lot of different ways you could do it, and a lot of different ways you could twist up the factions. But I would take a lot of factions that were good and turn them bad. I would take some that are bad and turn them good. I would get rid of a lot of them. You could have the Mournland expand. You could have, maybe there's a whole other section that's turned into a second Mournland because another weapon went off. All kinds of things that you could do in here that I think would be really fun. But boy, it's going to be a dark campaign. It's going to be like a post-apocalyptic campaign. But it sounds like that's what you're running. So Alexander, that is what I would. Ryan, how do you handle a mistake? This is an important one. How do you handle a mistake you've made when you realize it mid-session or combat? For example, my player asked that we take a break from animal murder, and then in the next session I was running a published adventure and threw some animals into the fight because I forgot to reskin as something gross and totally killable. I only realized this mid-battle. I apologized after the fact. Yeah. Right away. The answer is you want to handle something like that right away. And you might just, the minute you find it out, you might say, hang on, everybody, I just need to take a break. You should also not be opposed to rolling back, right? And to just saying like, I made a mistake. I said that these things were wolves. They are, let me describe them again. They have tentacle, they're undead, right? You realize these wolves aren't real wolves. They are undead wolves and they got tentacles growing out of them, or they're half plant wolves, right? You can change things right away. And this is one that's important, that if you've had a player who trusted you to say, I don't want to have any more violence against animals in my game, and then you did it, first thing you need to do is pause and just say, can we take a quick break? I need a quick break. And then talk to them one-on-one and say, I'm sorry, I screwed up, right? I wasn't thinking and I did this. How would you feel about these changes that I'll make? And to see if they make the changes. Then you go back and say, hey, everybody, we're going to make a quick change, right? These aren't wolves. These are mutants from the Forbidden Zone, right? And go with that. But really with something like this, on like an X card sort of thing, you want to handle it as fast as possible. Handle it, the whole point of like an X card and something like this is that you don't want to have to put somebody on the spot to defend themselves, right? So you don't say, oh, hey, is it okay if these are still wolves? And then they have to say no again. You don't want to do that. So instead, it's better to say, they told you, stop, take a break, talk to them offline, maybe set up a separate chat or whatever if you're playing online and say, hey, I'm really sorry I did that. And here's what I did. And here's how can we fix it? What can we do to fix it? With them one-on-one. Then you come back, you take responsibility, you change it. You don't even bring them up, right? But it's important. And this is one of those, there are a few times, because, people are hard, right? Playing with people, working with people, dealing with people, personalities is hard. And sometimes we have to act quickly. Right? Like many times it's good if there's a problem for us to sit back and kind of separate ourselves from the problem and deal with it. But then there's some situations that we're in right now where you have to handle it right away. If somebody's harassing somebody else, you have to handle it right away. And this is an area where like DMs, like we've accepted this role to be dungeon masters. And it's like, I shouldn't have to deal. I'm not a psychotherapist, right? I'm not, but we are taking an area of responsibility of management of our game. And when we take responsibility for the management of our game, that we're taking on a bit of the happiness of our players. And it can be risky, right? And so there are times where there are things that happen that we're in the position to help, right? And in that position, we should do something about it. So if a player is harassing another player, we stop it right away. If somebody steps over the bounds on that we have for like our lines and veils, we have to stop it right away. If somebody says something that's just inappropriate, we do our best, right, to do something about it right away. So sometimes we really have to do something right away. And that's not easy to do. Confrontation is hard. Confrontation sucks. It's the hardest part of this game. Hardest part of the game is finding players to play regularly. But dealing with people issues is by far, you go to like any of the D&D forums or any of the D&D groups and you look at the problems they're having, they're almost always people issues. It's very rare. It's like, oh, I have a problem with shield. It's like, no, I have a problem because one of my players is being a dick to one of my other players. What do I do, right? And we're not always best equipped to do it. I suck at confrontation. I'm terrible at it, right? But sometimes I have to do it, right? And I try to do my best, right? And I make mistakes and everybody makes mistakes and we try to do with it. But the answer to your question is I would try, if something like happens, even if you're in the middle, just say, hey, everybody, I need to take a quick break, right? And you don't have to say why, but you take a quick break. You talk, you try to resolve the situation, try to fix it. Especially with something like that, where somebody did make that attempt ahead of time to tell you what they needed to do. So really good question, Ryan. Thank you for bringing that up. Thank you for bringing up the situation that you had so that we can all learn from it, because I think it's really important. James M. says, building my next campaign in the City of Arches with Acquisitions Incorporated type gameplay. Awesome. Thank you for both. City of Arches is very Hotel California. You get in, but you don't get out for most people who end up there. Trying to figure out a mechanic that would allow the party to travel through an arch on a mission to other planes, but would pull them back in X amount of time. Yeah, so I talked about this. I sent you a message about this, and I think this can work. That you can. There could be all kinds of different ways characters can go through the arch. You might have a key that only lets you through once, and maybe back. But you might have something else. And I had this idea when I heard your question, that we have the Tower of Cartan, right? These shady wizards in the Tower of Cartan, and they're up to stuff. What if they have a way that, like, look, we can't get you all the way through a portal, but we can sort of treat it like a bubble that you can step through, and you can sort of step inside, and it will envelop you like you're stepping through cellophane. And you can go inside and you can do some stuff, and then it'll snap you back. It's like you're attached to rubber bands, and the rubber band will whip you back. It's almost like going to the astral sea. If you go into the astral plane, you have this tether that connects you to your homeworld to the astral plane, right? Some go there directly, but many other travelers that go to the astral plane have this tether that tethers them back to their physical form in the other one. You could treat the City of Arches the exact same way. The arches could be a way to step through into another world, but you're tethered back to your original, and it will snap you back, almost like going into a dream version of the world. So I think I would definitely have like the Wizards of Cartan come up with options for that. And that's a scary sound. When you hear running water behind you, that's never a good sound, but I think it's our washer just dumping some water. So you can definitely, you can definitely play with those arches in lots of different ways. You might have a key that only works once. You might have a key that's a temporary key. You might have a key that works to let you in, but it snaps you back. You might have a key that's a permanent key, right? And there's all different ways that you could do it. Like, they could be keys that don't work reliably every time, or they don't send you to the same place. There's all sorts of different ways to play with the arches and the keys to really support any of the kinds of stories that you want to tell there. I designed the arches that way, and I have a couple paragraphs of text in City of Arches that talk specifically about this. By the way, City of Arches, if you're not aware what this is, it is a city source book that is available to patrons of Sly Flourish. If you become a patron of Sly Flourish, you can pick up the City of Arches too. 22-page city source book built for adventure. Step Back says, I'm curious, as someone who primarily runs homebrew content, if you read adventures you don't plan on running for inspiration, and if you read them cover to cover, or some other method. The answer is yes. I read other adventures for inspiration all the time. And no, I don't read them cover to cover. I often skim. I look at art. I'll poke through it. Some of them I read deeper than others, but many times I just kind of absorb what I absorb and let that kind of flow in with everything else. I don't have a good system for it. I don't have a method. I get everything. Right. So I got like the one that I just got recently was Bane Warrens, something of the Bane Warrens by Monty Cook Games. Let's take a quick look. So Bane Warrens is an updated adventure. It was originally written for 3.5. Now it is updated to 5th edition by Monty Cook Games. And it's a 180-page adventure, right? And I love it. I got it as part of the Kickstarter for Tolas. And I actually have the original Bane Warrens somewhere around here. I had the 3.5 that I think it was Sword and Wizardry that put it out or something like that. And I'm not going to read the whole 180-page cover to cover, but I'm definitely going to read like the synopses and look at the chapters and poke at the maps and look at NPC art. You just sort of absorb it, right? You just sort of flip through it. I actually wish I had the physical version of this. It's easier for me to flip through a lot of these things on their physical versions. But a lot of times what I do is my method is I get a new product, I throw it on my desktop, and when I have some time to kill, rather than surfing freaking Reddit, I will instead take a look at a new product that I picked up and just let it kind of flow over me. Some of it I'm able to pick up quite a bit. Some of it are huge. What was the one, the Oathbreaker, Throne of the Oathbreaker, right? Which was like 900 pages. Like, I'm not reading that cover to cover, but boy, it was pretty cool, pretty inspirational. So Step Back, that's kind of my process and method, but I'm sure many of us have different ones. But yeah, the main thing is, yes, we can absolutely use published work to inspire our homebrew campaigns, and I recommend it. Many people do it. Rengdo says, your recent article on pacing, link in the show notes, made me wonder what you think about in-universe pacing. I'm running 2 games with entirely different groups and completely different systems and settings, 1 sandbox, 1 investigation, and they have the same issue. The players will not let their PCs relax. They insist on the PCs using every hour of every day engaged with the plot, hooks, and clues. I've told them we could just skip forward in time, but they don't want to. This wouldn't be a problem, except that it means that things happen in the setting incredibly and plausibly quickly because it has to react to the PC's actions. How do I slow the players down without them losing engagement? It's a really tough problem because your players are kind of telling you they want to play a certain way. And so if you try to change the way that they're going to play, they might not be as happy. But one of them is like you can have external events where they just don't have the information they need. And it's going to take them time. And maybe the downtime is them doing the research. It took Gandalf like a year to figure out that the ring that Bilbo had that now was in Frodo's possession is actually this ring of power, right? It takes 30 seconds in the movie, but in time, it's like a year that he's like out researching this ring. And what is this thing, right? And he's looking at all these notes and then he discovers what it is. Like, oh my God, we got to go back and deal with that ring, right? And goes back there, right? So sometimes they don't have the information they need. And sometimes the information takes a long time to get. Sometimes they have contacts that say like, look, it's going to take me 2 weeks to get the information you want. And that's 2 weeks that you have to do other things. So there's only so much investigation that they can do. And you are kind of in control of that. You can kind of decide how much investigation they can do. So that's, churn your own dials is one possible way to deal with this, maybe, is to churn your own dials. But then the other one is to talk to the players a little bit more. I kind of described what you think would be fun and about how it's been going and get an idea what they find is fun. Do they think that downtime would be fun, right? And another thing I do is I will declare a downtime time. I'll say, we now have some downtime. We could take a week or two for you to do these other things, right? And sort of define, just like you say, roll for initiative. You can also say, we're now going to be in a downtime session, right? Or a downtime sequence where you can say, like, we're going to expand out to days and weeks rather than minutes and hours. So that's just a couple of thoughts. I hope that helps. Zeke W says, do you have any recommendations for DMs when deciding to surprise players versus surprising their characters? For example, if a character has something interesting in their backstory that only the player and the DM are aware of at the start of the campaign, or perhaps the identity of a secretive person that the players otherwise won't learn about until much later in the campaign. I'm a big fan of twists in the media I consume, and I imagine twists can be well done in RPGs. Not always the way you think. However, surprising the players somewhat forbids asking for feedback beforehand, and surprising the characters isn't as exciting and can frustrate players who want to use out-of-character knowledge. It can actually be really fun. I've definitely had circumstances where it can be really fun for the players to know something the characters don't know, because then they have to role play a certain way, right? And that can be a good time. I will have flashbacks or I'll have cutscenes of events that the characters don't know, but the players do, right? And that can be fun. The trick about twists is that it's more fun when the twists just happen, right? It's better when a twist just happens instead of you trying to figure out a twist that's going to work, because sometimes it won't work the way you think, because you have 5 other actors in your story here that aren't reading the script. They're doing whatever they're doing, and that changes things. So it can be tricky. So surprising characters can still happen, but it's better when it happens organically. It's better when if you're surprised, you're like, oh, I bet this thing happens, and in this session, I'm going to reveal it. The surprises that often don't work well are when it takes place, you know something that's going to take place a long time from now. I do recall a Ghost of Saltmarsh game I had. It was actually one of the ones that I prepped for, where the big surprise about who was leading the secret cult, the secret organization known as the Scarlet Brotherhood, who was leading them? A vampire that they allied. The characters allied with a vampire, and the vampire used charm and immediately dissected the entire cult, dissected the whole organization of the cult. And then they said, hey, I want to tell you some things, and brought in one of the cult members that was a character that one of the players knew, not as a cult member, and said, who do you work for? He said, I work for this dwarf. He goes, who do you really work for? He said, I work for the Scarlet Brotherhood. And they're like, oh my God. And he says, yeah, who's your leader? And he dissected the whole thing. It was really fun. Even though all 15 surprises got dropped in 5 minutes, it was really fun for the players to suddenly realize, wow, boy, having a vampire as a friend is really, really useful. So you can play with that, but letting the story evolve as it goes is, I find, far more fun for both me as a DM and for the players, because some of the things that the surprises are not predetermined. They just happen. And that's where things get really cool. So Zeke, I hope that answers your question. Jason K says, do you have any tips for running D&D games laden with political intrigue? I'm inspired by the rich tapestry of courtly life between various countries in such shows as Game of Thrones, Spanish Princess, Medici, and Isabel. Sadly, I find tracking of all parties to be a bit daunting, as well as determining their machinations. I'm hoping you might have some tips and tricks that would make it easy for a lazy DM to run engaging campaigns with political intrigue. Maybe you even have some random generators that might help with this. Anything you can offer would be greatly appreciated. Thank you, Jason. So I've talked about this in other shows too, and I think there are two things you can do. One is for each of the political factions, you might have like one person that's in charge of a political faction. They have a goal and they have steps that they're accomplishing or steps that they're taking to accomplish that goal. You do that for each one of the factions. So you know what they want, you know where they're going, and you know what steps they're taking to get there. And then the other one is secrets and clues. As those guys are moving forward, as those political things are moving forward, artifacts of those movements are showing up as secrets that the characters can discover while they're navigating the game. The reality is, unless your characters are really, really tightly wound around the campaign, they're not going to know a lot of what's going on. And you might want to reduce the number of factions and the number of goals that are going on. That can be really hard. But if you mix those two ideas together, have a faction, have a goal for that faction, have the steps that they're taking, and then each week you can look at each faction and say, how have they done in theirs? How have they collided? Has one group killed another or destroyed another? Has one group taken over another? And then let the artifacts from those drop in as secrets and clues, so they're things that the characters can discover during their game. So that is how I would run it, but generally speaking, I try to keep these kinds of political ones relatively simple because players are having enough trouble understanding what we're saying some of the time. So good luck. Kyle says, any advice for dealing with players that love to get a jump on combat? I have one PC in particular who often senses that an encounter is headed towards combat and tries to get a free hit before we roll initiative. This usually triggers the other characters to try to get an action as well, often asking, does my spell go off, etc. I find this really frustrating. As we are just cutting to the chase instead of getting to the dialogue, leading them there naturally. The answer is, anytime any actor commits some violence against someone else, you go to initiative. You don't get to jump ahead of initiative. If a character says, I'm going to ready an action to throw a fireball at that guy when he does some violence, you stop and say, well, let's roll for initiative, because they might be able to do that thing before you can get your reaction off, because initiative is the ultimate determination for who goes when. So the minute something is going towards hostility, you can roll for initiative, and things happen in initiative order. A couple of interesting things: you cannot ready an action outside of initiative, right? That you cannot ready like an attack outside of initiative. You can only ready once you've had your turn in an initiative order. So the minute somebody says, I'm going to ready it, you would then say, let's go to initiative, and we'll see if you're able to do it. But that key is initiative happens before anything else. Nobody can ready a bunch of actions in initiative. Now, inside initiative, you get this tricky bit of like somebody got banished and we're waiting for them to come back and we're all going to ready our actions so that the minute they drop back in, we're going to attack them. You're not going to roll for initiative again, right? So that one actually works. But yeah, take a look. I have an article about surprise that talks about this sort of thing. But the general answer is, there is no such thing as a surprise round. You always roll for initiative. And you roll for initiative the minute anybody tries to do any kind of... Joe M says, I am running a Ruins of the Grendelroot campaign, and the acquisitions incorporated downtime rules. The party has turned Starsong Tower into a thriving coffee shop. Yay! How do you recommend deciding how much downtime occurs between adventures when there isn't a villain or some other timed event driving the story? And if many 4 to 5 weeks go by, do you talk through all 4 to 5 activities for each player, or do you limit or summarize them? I go pretty loose. Talk to the players. Ask them how much time they would like to spend on things. Ask them what kind of things they want to do and how much time is available to do it. And you might say like, well, I want to make a magic sword. Well, that's going to be 16 months. You probably don't want to have downtime for 16 months. But maybe everybody's like, no, I think it'd all be cool if we did this downtime for 16 months. And then you say, okay, 16 months pass and let's talk about that, right? You can have these big things. But talking about with the players, I think, is really a key. And then you don't have to be too systematic about it. So you can also dramatically increase or reduce the amount of time that you spend when you're talking to a particular player. Maybe the thing they're doing turns into combat and then you go into combat. Maybe it takes 3 weeks, so you expand it to 3 weeks. So the time spent in downtime is very flexible. And it's really that conversation, that improv-y conversation we're having with our players to determine about how downtime occurs, how much time they want to spend, things like that. So Joe, I hope that helps answer your question. Alico Kane says, I am planning to run Ruins of the Grendelroot pretty soon. 2 Ruins of the Grendelroot ones, right back to back. And I was thinking of giving players improved named spells from time to time as loot, like Grethel's Fireball that could leave a place on fire. How would you handle these kind of improvements to not break the game or make non-magic users still relevant? So the idea of spells as loot is very cool. And one thing is you can use spells as loot anyway without changing the mechanics of them. You could just say like Cone of Cold is a hard spell to find, right? This is something Level Up 5e, Level Up Advanced 5e, did a really good job of having like multiple variants. There's like a fireball and there's like a named fireball. And the named fireball is like a rare piece of loot that is a bigger fireball. A way to balance this is to look at spells that are one level up. And you might say like the spell that you get that's a named spell might be as powerful as a spell that's one level up from it. So you can kind of use that as a baseline. You probably don't want to do 2 or 3. And the idea you have is good, which is just, can you add a kicker onto it? Can you add one small thing that it does that makes it slightly different than the other ones? But I think the idea of named spells as a form of loot is really cool. And it doesn't have to make non-magic users relevant because you can give them cool loot too. You can give them loot that does spells, right? So yeah, I mean, as long as you're paying attention to making sure that the kind of loot you're giving your spellcasters, you can also give to your non-spellcasters that is, equal. I think things will be fine. Of course, you're scaling up the game, right? That's a lot of extra power that you're giving to your players, so you want to keep that in mind too. But it's a cool idea. The idea of named spells is really cool, and I like that. CB says, I just watched the integrating characters into the campaign video and loved it. I've often centered adventures around a character's background story, but I've run into the issue and I don't know if there's a solution. Unfortunately, there's always a session or two during an adventure where the focused player can't make it. This leaves the rest of the group wondering if we should cancel until they can play again or make it without them. We've done both, but it always feels like there should be some elegant solution to this. Yeah. So if you have a part of an adventure that really requires one player to be there, that's going to be tricky. And you might have to run a one-shot game or like a flashback scene or maybe a side quest that the characters go on. Something that, 3 weeks ago we did this other thing, right? You could do something like that. Another trick is to make sure that you don't have a quest that just requires one character, but maybe 2 of them. So if only one of them is there, it can still go on, right? If 2 characters are both tied to a particular quest, if they go there and that character can't make, the other character can still kind of take over for them. But it is a risk. When you build an entire adventure around a character, that's definitely a risk. And so if you're going to do so, you want to kind of make sure you're not doing it to a player who's not necessarily going to be there. Because the reality is you don't have to do this all the time. You don't have to have quests that are built around one specific character. Right, that's not necessarily something that you always have to do, and this is a good reason why. That if you want to have a resilient quest where whatever players are in there, it can still work out. CB, good question. Bo T says, I'm currently planning my session 0/1 for Descent into Avernus using the Fall of Elturel starting adventure. In doing so, I'm a little worried that I won't be able to make the finale of Fall of Elturel in the first session. So my question is how to add a grand reveal like the disappearance of Elturel in the middle of the session instead of at the end, as it is planned in Fall of Elturel. I think that adventure is very flexible in the amount of time you can spend on it, that there's a lot of different things that you can do, a lot of different encounters that occur while you're running around the hills of Elturel before the fall. But you could shrink that drastically. You could have only one encounter. Maybe there's like 3 cultists that are attacking the girl who's up in the tree, right? Rhea, right? Rhea? No, the other girl, the one with the rainbow scarf, right? And you can cut a lot of it. So if I were going to do it, I would cut a lot of it to get it to the point where the Elturel falls at the end of the session in your session 0. I think you could get that adventure down to like an hour if you needed to, because it's not that big and there's a lot of different things where you could shrink it down. If you wanted it to go 2 sessions, you could lengthen it a bit and make it 2 full sessions, like a session and a half, your session 0 and 1, and then the end of session 2, and then add more cults and add more things and add more intrigue and stuff like that. The other one is have it fall in the middle of the adventure. Have it fall in the middle of your first full adventure, and then take a break right after it happens, and then come back and say 2 months have passed. You're now at the gates of Baldur's Gate, right? And you can do a jump cut in the middle of the session. And I think that could still be really powerful. And I think by having this large time jump right in the beginning, I still think it could be very cool. So, Bo, I hope that helps. And I love that Fall of Elturel is a fantastic way to play Descent into Avernus. My friends, that is it for today's Lazy D&D Talk Show. We have just a handful of questions. Maybe I might kick these off to next month. I'm not sure. I kind of hate to do that because I get tons of questions. So we may have a separate episode where we cover the remainder of the tips. But I want to thank everybody for hanging out with me today. It is always a great pleasure to hang out with you and to enjoy this wonderful hobby of ours. If you enjoyed this show, you can help me out in 4 ways. You can subscribe to the Sly Flourish newsletter, support me directly on Patreon, pick up any of my books on the Sly Flourish bookstore, or subscribe to my videos right here on YouTube. Thank you all very much. Have a great day and get out there and play some D&D.